Oriental Hotel. Suasananya adalah seperti ini. Kita lagi prepare Zoom dengan International Organization.
Results and just on conducting the research in the first place. In general, this type of research is very valuable to any process of ensuring and observing whether or not laws and regulations are having the desired effect. Recall that when COP was adopted, the intention was indeed to use this as an instrument to try to promote compliance with existing regulations. And several years down the line, it is important for actors involved to evaluate and assess the extent to which this regulation is working. I know that when trade unions have the research capacity to be able to document whether or not these regulations are effective, it's a real added value to the process and really gives an impression from the workers' perspective of what the reality is on the ground, which is something that's not always easy to capture. As you may be aware, the ILO is a tripartite organization that we represent governments as well as employers' organizations and workers' organizations. This exercise, then, like I said, is a good example of what trade unions can do in contributing towards the achievement of decent work for workers, in this case for domestic workers. Private recruitment and employment agencies are playing an important role in domestic work in certain regions and certainly in Hong Kong. When there are many private employment agencies that are playing this role, the extent to which they can influence the lives of hundreds of thousands or more domestic workers is really not negligible. When there's a law that's in place, it's a good first step towards ensuring decent work for domestic workers, but without implementation, there really is no chance for achieving it. In the case of results of this report are showing that domestic workers on the ground are still frequently facing illegal recruitment fees being charged. And some of the efforts that are being made to promote compliance are still, they're bringing some cases to justice. But now too many are still feeling the pressure of the agencies. I see that the interpretation is having some trouble. Fish, would you like me to slow down or stop?
No, I think so. Just asking for the previous session with that.
I just wanted to make sure. So in light of some of these practices that are being revealed in the research, such as the charging of illegal recruitment fees, and others such as confiscation of passports, are frequently considered to be indicators of forced labor. There's a list of different indicators of forced labor that was compiled by the ILO, and in some cases it can amount to situations of forced labor. In view of how widespread these practices are throughout the world, where private recruitment agencies are present, the ILO adopted several years ago now the guidelines and principles on fair recruitment, and I think it's worth spending a moment to recall what the purpose and what some of the spirit was behind those guidelines. First of all, they are adopted by our tripartite constituents. So although they're not binding, they do represent and reflect agreement among workers, employers, and governments around the world. which I think is a point that bears a lot of value within the greater world of work. When guidelines were adopted, they did two things. They first determined some of the situations and practices that are contributing to violating decent work. They're also highlighting the key role that each of the different actors are playing in the work. And then they highlight some key points around recruitment fees and costs specifically, including a listing of definitions of what can be included in recruitment and fees. They really responsibilities of governments and also of trying to international labor standards with respect to related costs. So they're just 3 points from these guidelines that would be worth raising at this stage in light of the findings of the report. The first is that the point 5 of the guidelines, is that employment and recruitment activities should be clear and transparent to be enforced. The role of the labor inspectorate and the use of standardized registration, licensing, or certification should be highlighted. The authorities should take specific measures against abusive and fraudulent recruitment methods, including those that could result in forced labor or trafficking in persons. The second point that I think is worth mentioning from the guidelines, point 6, is that recruitment across international borders should respect the applicable national laws, regulations, employment contracts, and collective agreements of countries of origin, transit, and destination, and internationally recognized human rights, including the fundamental principles and rights at work and relevant international labor standards. These laws and standards should be effectively implemented. And finally, the last point, point 7, states that no recruitment fees or related costs should be charged to or otherwise borne by workers or job seekers. So in short, why did I select these 3 points? I think the first one really points to the role of the labor inspectorate, ensure compliance, including through some of the methods that we have heard highlighted in this report and some of the recommendations that are being made. The second reason why I raise these points is because I think that as we see that these agencies are working and operating in different countries, so even though they're acting across international borders, there thus remains a point in these guidelines that states that there still must be a respect for the laws that are applicable in both country of origin and destination and transit. So the third and final point on recruitment fees, I think, bears no explanation. The guidelines and principles, there is a lot more information on what exactly can be considered a legitimate fee or related cost, but I think you'll find that the summary is really that no recruitment fees or related costs should be charged to or otherwise borne by workers or job seekers. So what do we do now? I think that, again, continuing to document the lived experiences of domestic workers and hearing your testimonies like during this meeting is a very invaluable source of information. The role that voices of domestic workers can play in highlighting the policy gaps and the implementation gaps is essential. Secondly, I think that there's a lot more room to continue to implement and promote the COP, and maybe also consider the adoption of other instruments or methods that can help to promote compliance with the regulations in Hong Kong. Finally, I think that there is space to raise more awareness publicly about the role that private recruitment agencies are playing generally. I think that the role of households as employers of domestic workers is one that can come into more focus. What role do households have as clients of private recruitment agencies? How can they become better consumers of the services that agencies are supplying? And how can the government become more aware as well about the dynamics, let's say, between the private agencies, the household employers, and the domestic workers? I think there are more and more practices around the world that are helping to move us towards
Kalau nggak
decent
pakai
work
headset
for
suaranya
domestic
ngantuk.
workers, including in cases where recruitment agencies are playing a large role.